May the words of my lips and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
Amen. The question, "Who is my neighbor?" launches Jesus into this story unique to Luke, meaning everyone and anyone and everyone is our neighbor. What a beloved parable. We know it so well. We even have a law on our modern books called the Good Samaritan Law. We know it so well, it practically preaches itself. Or do we know it that well? I dug into it some earlier this last week, and I came upon some findings that I'd like to share with you. We all know that Samaritans and Judeans didn't get along. Historically, Samaria and Judea were only united during the reigns of two kings, David and Solomon. Before and after that, these two neighboring regions were constantly at odds with each other. The books of Kings and Chronicles are all about the battles between the kings of the north and the south. And there was more at stake than simple politics, for kings were also responsible for the right worship of God. The two kingdoms had different ways of worshiping God. In the south, worship was centralized in the great temple in Jerusalem. They considered worship anywhere else anathema. Yet in the north, worship centered on Mount Gerizim. So, two sibling nations, neighbors, divided both by politics and religion. But wait, there's more. There's another layer of division in our parable, because within Judea's worship of God, in Jesus' time, there were no fewer than 4 major parties, 2 of which show up in our story today, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Their names are perhaps familiar to you. The Sadducees were the priests. In the line of Levi, they were also called Levites. They were responsible for maintaining the temple and all that happened there, for its sacrifices and rituals and holy festivals. And they were notoriously corrupt at Jesus' time. They favored rule from outside powers like Herod or Rome for the simple goal of keeping the peace and maintaining their status. Interestingly enough, theologically, they only believed in the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And that's important. I'll get back to that. The other major party was the Pharisees. These were teachers, rabbis. They lived among the people and they taught in the synagogues. Pharisees were often called lawyers or scribes because they were experts in the law, i.e., those first 5 books of the Bible. But unlike the Sadducees, they also held the writings of the prophets and the wisdom writings and the Psalms and the books of history as Holy Scripture. This was important because they sought to apply the law to its current lived-in context among the people. Put that on the shelf. We'll come back to it. Matthew's version of this scene gives us some insight into Luke's setting as well, into, in fact, the lawyer who questions Jesus. Because in Matthew's version, the Pharisees' question immediately follows Jesus schooling some Sadducees in the law. The Pharisees' question, therefore, although useful, honest enough in its content, is nonetheless asked in the spirit of rivalry with the Sadducees. And so Jesus has a lesson for both of them. The parable begins exactly as the Pharisee expects to hear. There's a man dying on the side of a dangerous road, And not one, but two Sadducees pass him by. It was more important for them to stay ritually clean for temple sacrifices, even if it meant leaving him to die. And in this scene, I can imagine the Pharisee nodding along like, yep, how like a Sadducee. Then Jesus throws the curveball. It's not a Pharisee. It's not even a Judean. It's a Samaritan who helps the man, who risks his own life because those robbers probably weren't far off, who generously pours wine and oil on his wounds, heaves him onto his own donkey, carries him to an inn, prepays for his care, and promises to come back with more if needed. I wonder how startled the Pharisee was. Clearly, Luke's version is not just about taking care of our neighbors. The lawyer wanted self-justification and was tied up in that. You see, self-justification and self-righteousness are different from justification and righteousness. Self-righteousness, self-justification is a defense mechanism. It's when our pride is threatened, our egos are threatened. So we puff ourselves up, we stop listening, and we build up anger and hostility. But righteousness means following Jesus. It means asking, who would Jesus leave to die on the side of the road? It means to stop being distracted by the navel-gazing of our internal affairs and get out there and help. Well, last Monday, the bishops of Texas did just that. Politically, these Episcopal bishops span the spectrum, from conservative to liberal, from Republican to Democrat. But they are on the ground. They see the suffering coming across our border. And this is what they wrote last week. We write to decry the conditions in detention centers at our border because we are Christians, and Jesus is unequivocal. We are to pray without ceasing for everyone involved, refugees, elected officials, and law enforcement, while also advocating for the humane treatment of the human beings crowding our border as they flee the terror and violence of their home countries. We call on our leaders to trust in the goodness, generosity, and strength of our nation. God has blessed us with great abundance. With it comes the ability and responsibility to bless others. We do this because Christians are commanded to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, and how we are to treat our neighbors, especially the children, could not be any clearer. On July 13, 1994, 25 years ago yesterday, fire destroyed our sanctuary. It was Congregation Beth Ahaba who picked us up off the side of the road. They welcomed us. Rabbi Jack Spiro walked up the street and told the priest, who had only been here 2 weeks, use our sanctuary as long as you need. That gesture was one of infinite mercy. They shared their very sanctuary with us, had a cross in their space. Our children were baptized there. And forever, their generous and holy act of sacrifice, hospitality, and mercy has formed bonds of friendship between our two congregations. To this day, this is one of the most important moments in the life of our parish. When I arrived here 4 years ago, it's the primary story of joy and pride I heard from everyone here, and I continue to hear it. St. Jamesers know that in the split second it takes lightning to strike, we could be the ones in need of help. We prayed today in our collect for the knowledge and wisdom to know what we ought to do and the grace to do it. May God's grace be upon us all now. Amen.